Well, we are going to begin our time here in a little informal Q&A. So you can continue to eat, grab you some more food in the back. There's plenty of it. There's still breakfast tacos left over, plenty of boxed lunches for you as well. You can refresh your water and coffee at the same time. So, Tom, we just want to thank you for all your time and your prep that you put into really taking a lot of biblical text and condensing it down into a way that was efficient in the time that you were allotted. I know that you're probably going to ask and request for more time next year when we continue this theme, but thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you. It's my joy. No, that's what we all do, ask for more time, or take it when we're not given to us.
So we've got about 20 minutes of Q&A here. Some of you guys have submitted questions here on site. We've received questions online. Our plan is to get through a few of those. I know Tom, so that may be tough to get through more than 3 or 4 here in that time slot. But we're going to collect those questions and be able to answer those in some format after the conference and get those things out to you. So your questions may not get answered here, but at some point here in the near future, we'll get those answers to you. So as we sort of get going here, Tom, I would like to start broad and then kind of narrow down on some of the particulars of what you talked about and those subject matters. But in your first session, you talked about benefits of a plurality of elders. You mentioned protecting against your own sinful heart, the collective wisdom, and those benefits. I want to flip that, and I want to talk about the dangers maybe of not implementing a plurality of elders. What are the dangers, really 2 parts. First, for the leadership of the church, and then maybe even the sheep or the congregants.
Well, I think it starts, big picture, with it's the opposite of what we talked about in the first session, and that is it's clearly out of step with both the pattern and the mandate of Scripture. So honestly, I would say that there's an element, once you understand it, once you know what the Scriptures teach and you've dealt with it and you've studied it, and you become convinced that it's what the Bible teaches, then it's disobedience to do anything else. And so it starts there. It's just simple disobedience to the Lord. But I think practically, when you start looking at the disadvantages first to the pastor, the last thing in the world I want is the full weight of responsibility for everything that happens at Countryside. I mean, I don't want to be the guy who's making the decision about how this thing that affects the future life of the church is going to be made, because I know my own shortcomings. I know there are certain areas where I'm stronger and certain areas where I'm weaker, and I know I'm not strong in every area. I'm not strong in every decision that needs to be made. And so I love being able to rely on the strength and the wisdom of other men and together, coming together. You know, that's the beauty of plurality, is each person, normally every person, certainly most in any conversation, can contribute some wisdom to that discussion, and it brings that sense of collective wisdom. But I think if you don't have that, I mean, every decision is your decision, and that may sound like a good idea until it's a bad decision, and then the entire weight of that rests on you, and you bear, if it goes well, you bear the full privilege and the accolades that come with that. If it goes poorly, it's your responsibility and yours alone. And that's a lonely place to be, particularly if it was a bad decision, if you didn't have the necessary wisdom and you didn't get the counsel to make it. So honestly, for me, that's a big one, because we're talking about the church. We're not talking about, okay, I made a decision as to what car we bought for our family. I mean, that can be remedied pretty quickly, but we're talking about our Lord's church. And so the decisions we make carry this huge weight of responsibility. I think another disadvantage to the pastor, if he takes that sort of I'm the guy making, running things and all of that, is it spreads you so thin. I mean, you can't do it. Like I said, you can do it with a certain size church, but if I were the sole elder at Countryside Bible Church, it would be impossible for all of the spiritual ministry that needs to happen here to happen. It just wouldn't happen. What happens is people get neglected, and needs aren't met, and issues aren't addressed, and teaching that needs to happen doesn't happen, and error isn't refuted, and on and on. It's just impossible. So I think those are the two biggest downsides. Three. One is obviously the issue of obedience. Then the weight of all of those decisions resting on you, and then just the inability to complete all of that ministry if you're running it alone. As far as on the church, I think they miss out on the divine intention. I mean, I showed you, it's always been God's way to work through a plurality. And so if you don't do that, your people aren't getting a chance to see that fleshed out. They're not benefiting from that collective wisdom. And I think they're not being, kind of the reverse of what I said before, they're not being adequately shepherded. And I think they sense that. They know that. They feel like, I have needs. I can never meet with the pastor because he can never get to me. And so I just think there are some major issues as a result. But if you take every one of those chief duties of a shepherd that I listed, and overseer, and you water them down because there aren't enough men to do them, then every one of those suffers. And that means the individuals in the church suffer in each one of those ways.
That's great. So you talked about, I think just in your last session, really session 2 and 3, the idea of staff elders, paid elders, lay elders. So in terms of decision making in the church, how do you weigh that out? As far as you've got staff elders who are just generally more aware of maybe what is going on in the life of the church on a day-to-day basis, as opposed to elders who might not be able to because of whatever their occupational focus is. So how do you balance just decision making across the church?
Well, I think first of all, let me say that it may be a failure on the staff's part to keep the lay elders informed. That is part of our duty, to make sure they do know what's going on in the life of the church. Not every detail about every person, but largely what's going on in the life of the church. So it might be a failure to communicate at the level that needs to be communicated if the lay elders really feel like they don't know what's going on. In addition to that, as I said, you can't make the elder board as a whole can't make every decision, do everything, so they are going to practically delegate that. That's acceptable. So if the elder board says, okay, we're not going to run the XL conference, the elder board as a whole. So they say, we're going to delegate that to some of the staff, some of the volunteers. We're going to work with XL, Rocky, to marry the things that need to happen on campus with the things that XL's doing. Then that's acceptable. The elders can do that. They still know it's happening. They still know what's going on in the big picture. They know as many details as they want to know, but they're not actually running it. They're not actually managing it. And so that's how it functions, is there's that active delegation, continual delegation, where either it happens deliberately each time, or there's an understanding, okay, we're delegating to the staff or to this member of the staff or to this group of leadership among the staff this responsibility. And the understanding of that is, in my mind, it's, first of all, I need to keep all of the elders informed because it's all the elders' responsibility. And if there's an issue that comes up that's unusual, let's say they've delegated this responsibility to me, and I tool along and do what I do every day, every week, and nothing abnormal happens, but then a decision comes up that's out of the ordinary, that's unusual in my area of responsibility. Well, I know that I've been delegated normally to do this thing, but here's something out of the ordinary that the elders haven't discussed, haven't approved. I'm going to take that to the elders and get their direction and feedback. So I think it's that symbiotic relationship where there is the larger understanding of the responsibility of the elder board as a whole, and yet the practical understanding of those things have to be delegated. And then those who have received those points of delegation keep the elders as a whole informed and make sure that they're reflecting the elders' wishes, the elder board as a whole, its wishes and decisions. And if there are unusual things that come up, bring those back.
So you briefly touched on the idea, the biblical concept of staff elders, lay elders. So what would be your response to those in ministry, some of whom we would greatly agree with on many aspects of the gospel and ecclesiology, of course. What would you say to those who would promote the idea of only having staff elders, that the idea of maybe lay elders just isn't a biblical one, and it needs to be staff only?
First of all, I would argue you cannot say it's not a biblical one. I mean, you've got to deal with 1 Timothy 5:17. In Ephesus in the first century, there were elders who were paid and elders who weren't paid. So you can't say it's not biblical. You might argue, well, I'm not held to that pattern. And I know some friends of mine would argue that. And I would say to them that is unwise and unhealthy. And here's why. We as a deliberate decision on our elder board have decided there will always be more lay elders on the elder board than there are staff elders. And the simple reason is this. I would like to think and hope that I'm not a person prone to controlling and getting my way and so forth. But if I were, and more elders, if all the elders were staff elders, or if the majority of the elders on the elder board were staff elders, then I get everything I want, because those guys know if they really cross me, then their job may be at risk if I'm that kind of person and I put that kind of pressure. On the other hand, if there are more people on the elder board who don't get their salary from the church and aren't beholden to me as the senior pastor, the primary teaching elder, then they're going to be much freer, because their living, their livelihood, their future doesn't rest on whether I agree or disagree with them. They're going to be in a much better place to keep that sort of control from happening. So back to the protection idea, I think it's a great protection. Again, hopefully you aren't the guy who needs that. You aren't driven to control and dominate and get your way regardless. But you don't know who the next guy will be, and you don't know how he'll run the church, and so you have to think beyond yourself. You have to think what's healthy for the church. And clearly it's a biblical model. 1 Timothy's clear. And practically, it's a great protection for the church. I mean, not only, by the way, in practical decisions, but even doctrinally. Because where does a church go wrong doctrinally first, ordinarily? It's not the people sitting in the pew. It's some key influential leaders. And often that's driven by pastoral staff and not lay elders. So there's another protection built in there.
Yeah, Rocky had mentioned this earlier when we kicked off the conference, but he was speaking of when you came to Countryside in 2003 and your implementation of this biblical model and how that's remained healthy through the years, to the point where we now have a dozen or so elders here at Countryside. Now, many churches are represented here at this conference, so what would you say to those churches that currently have one elder and they're looking to implement, the process that we're laying out here with XL Ministries and the biblical pattern and those things? What would you say to that elder as far as moving forward and making additional elders?
Yeah. First of all, let me say that when I came in 2003, the church had been through some really hard times. But in God's goodness to me and to our church, there was already a solid group of elders who had formed and shaped out of that hard time. And my joy was to join with them and for us to work together. So it wasn't so much that I came in as the Savior. The Lord had rescued the church through a really godly group of men. That's my joy. Many of them still a part of our elder board. But I think in terms of the moving forward, I think it starts with having a plan and having practical materials. I think the average pastor and elder in a church who says, you know what, that's good, that's right, we need to do that. It's not the absence of a desire often that's the problem. It's the absence of a plan. It's the absence of a process that's manageable, that you can work through week after week, month after month to make sure that you're moving in that direction. With men who are gifted and called. That's the beauty of what the Lord allowed to take shape among the elders here. We fashioned that over time. Rocky has taken that and shaped and fashioned it and made it even, I think, a better, more suited to lots of churches. And so I think it's going to be a great tool. That's, in my mind, the key. It's like you got to have some way to get from where you are to the goal. And the best way to get there is to have very practical processes in place. So, for example, how do you go about choosing an elder? You need a practical process for that. You need a pattern that you follow, identifying potential elders in your church. Well, all of that's been done, and you may use it as in its form. You may say, I like that, but I'm going to tweak this. I'm going to shape this to fit our church. That's fine, but you don't have to create it from scratch, and that's where these materials come in and are very helpful. Say, okay, here's how to help identify them. Okay, now we've identified them. How do you train them without making a commitment to a guy before you know if he's really called and gifted? Well, again, that's been done before, and that's in the materials you're going to be receiving. But how do you bring that guy along and get him truly equipped for a bona fide testing, if you will? Not only a testing of his faithfulness in ministry, but a testing of his theology, testing of his biblical knowledge, a testing of how he's going to handle counseling situations. What do you do? What materials do you give him? You need a process. And again, that's what together, our church and our elder board, and of course Rocky was here for 18 years that I was here, and much longer than I. But the elders working together, helped shape and fashion this through the years, and now it's going to be given to you in a form that you can use. But I think that's the key. It's like you got to have a workable tool, and I think that's what our goal is, to try to make sure that tool is in the hands of those who want it.
That's great. So in your second session, you went through qualifications of an elder, and worked through all the C's there, craving, character in particular. 1 Timothy 3:4 talks about being able to manage your household, children that believe, etc. So how do you practically get into the life of the elder who aspires and desires? So how do you practically review that area or that category of his life?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, just practically, it's somebody you need to know. There needs to be time that passes. So you see this person week in and week out in his ministry at the church, and his faithfulness and what he does, how he handles himself. Somebody in leadership knows how he lives and what his home is like, what his interaction with his kids is like, what his interaction with his wife is like. There is a knowledge. Not that every elder has to have the equal level of knowledge, but we need to make sure that there are elders we have confidence in, and if they're elders, hopefully we do, they're in that person's life and can attest to those things. We also are going to ask the wife. We want to know, we have part of the application process is for the wife to give us her testimony, and for her to affirm, she's committed to the fact that her husband is qualified, that he meets the qualifications of Titus 1, 1 Timothy 3. We're going to ask her those questions. Is there anything in your husband's life that you believe falls short of these requirements? We're going to ask about, his personal disciplines in the Word and in prayer. All those things are going to be addressed and dealt with in that process. And so by the time you're done, the elder board collectively understands a lot, and then we rely on the more intimate knowledge of some who are maybe he's in their ministry, in their home fellowship, whatever, where they have a much more personal knowledge. So that's how it works. And then, of course, like I said, asking him, asking the wife, all those things. And let me say one more thing. That the other way that happens is at the very end of the process, what we do is in getting the church's confirmation is we'll present that potential elder that the elders have now put through the ringer, and we believe he does meet the qualifications and he's been tested. We will now present him to the congregation, and we'll say, look, for the next month, we want you, if you know him, we want you to go to him, and if you believe he's qualified, encourage him. Tell him how much you appreciate him. Tell him you're excited about what the Lord's done in his life. If you have any concerns about this man meeting these qualifications, we want you to do two things. We want you to go to him and share them, and we want you to come to an elder and share them so that we can talk about it. And that happens. We've had that happen on several occasions, and it's beneficial in the process. It may not be a concern that is disqualifying or whatever. In fact, it usually isn't if we've been through all of that. But it might be. It might be something that we didn't know about. But that way, we're not even relying on our knowledge. We're taking the larger scope of the people in the church who know this person.
That's great. Rocky, how much time do we have left, sir? Okay, we're going to transition. Well, Tom, thank you for your time this morning teaching. Thank you for this time in the Q&A as well. And it looks like we're transitioning here into our next segment.